No, it's okay.
First presentation of sickle cell disease may be when they're 6 months old. They have swollen hands and swollen feet, and it's clear there's something bad going on. Those children are treated appropriately. They're given pain medications. Everyone wants to do everything they can to help the baby. As you grow older, you have less of those manifestations. So you can present with crisis, and there is no objective measure that they're having a painful event. And so they suffer needlessly because no one actually believes that they're in pain. It is excruciatingly painful. There was actually a recent article published that sort of tried to capture what it's like to live with this disease on a daily basis. And 30% of the patients that were studied had pain 95% of days. But they didn't seek care. They sought care for like less than 20% of those days because they know they're probably not going to get the care they need. And the other is that they've learned to cope with a lot of pain on a daily basis. One of the reasons I opened this infusion clinic is because I got tired of hearing how I presented to such and such place and they didn't believe me, or they made me wait for hours and they didn't really treat me with what I knew would make me feel better.
So what's going on? Right now it's just mainly my wrist and lower part of my back. The pain is like a 7 out of 10 scale.
When I go to the emergency room, there's a bit of a stigma where they don't want to see, it seems like they don't want to see you straight away. And I see a doctor that's not willing to give me the typical medicine amount of medicine that will help me get out of pain. It's emotionally frustrating, and then deal with the stress of that on top of the pain already. It just makes it worse.
How's your pain level?
It's still a 7.
Once a patient has experienced 100 times over negative provider attitudes, you can imagine how they're going to feel when they present. And of course, then the provider now has more attitude because the patient has attitude, and so it becomes this circle and cycle of events which really leads to poor patient outcomes, and patients don't get what they need.
Let me take a quick listen to it. If I didn't have pain, like literally on a daily basis, it would probably bother someone that, you know, that doesn't normally experience it, but my tolerance for pain is so high, it's, you know, and I can't take like regular Tylenol or Advil or, you know, the over-the-counter medications. Those don't work. Yeah, it takes 5 to 6 milligrams of Dilaudid or morphine or both to get the pain under control, but that's what I need to get better. Whereas if I were at a facility that, you know, I visited for the first time, I'm a little reluctant to communicate that to them because I feel like they're judging me.
It used to be taught, and you can still find it in places, that if a patient tells you what dose of narcotic they need to treat their pain, that was a sign of addiction.
It's not even the verbal communication, it's the nonverbal communication that really gets under my skin, because, you know, you get this look and this tone like, okay, you've already had enough medicine, so I'm not giving you any more, or, you know, you have to have felt something. That's the worst. When I hear, you have to have felt that, you have to, and I'm like, no, if I did, I wouldn't be calling, I wouldn't be buzzing you every 10 minutes telling you I'm in pain.
The last thing you want to do is to piss off one of the medical staff, because you have to rely on them for care. And with a young family, I can't afford to be there around the clock.
I feel fortunate that I have children who see what I go through every day. My oldest son, Dorian, he'll come in and plug in my heating pad, or they'll all sit around in the bed with me until my husband gets home. When I'm in the hospital, I spend my entire time looking at the clock to make sure that I'm getting my medicine on time. I can't rest. I can't, you know, I just have to make sure that after 2.5 hours, I need to start buzzing the nurse, because otherwise I won't get my medicine on time. I feel like it makes me look like that's all that I'm there for.
They, don't always know if, you're telling the truth or if you're just there for whatever reasons that they might suspect.
What do they suspect?
Sometimes drug seeking, or that, you're exaggerating the symptoms for just the pain meds and not because you're actually in pain.
You can't tell them anything because they're the doctors. But I don't understand, what is the point in asking me my history or what works best for me if you're gonna do what you want anyway and you're still not listening to me?
I'll go through extra measures of making sure that, this is weird, but making sure that I'm dressed professionally before I go to the hospital, or not go in like sweats and, in my socks, because I don't feel like I'm being taken seriously.
It's just a remarkable thing, that I have to call ahead of time and say, so-and-so is coming in and they're a professional whatever, so therefore we're going to believe them. Whereas, this disease causes a lot of disability, and so a lot of my patients are unable to work. And so I can't call up and say, oh, they're, doctor, lawyer, whatever they are, to get them the kind of care they need. When you're sitting in an emergency room with the patient sitting across from you, what do you care if they're drug seeking? I mean, it's not your responsibility to make sure that the patient is not drug seeking. Yes, you soon send them home with 2 months worth of narcotic scripts. That's not your role in that setting. But you can treat the patient for their pain and manage their pain, and then refer them to someone who can take over the responsibility of managing their narcotics and seeing whether or not there might be an issue with their narcotic use. But in the emergency room setting, what difference does it make? If you're the person trying to make that decision, you'd hate to be wrong and say, oh, well, here's a patient who's in horrible pain and I didn't treat them because I didn't believe it. I don't want to be the provider who's wrong in making that decision, because if I'm wrong and the patient actually is in a lot of pain, I'm making that patient suffer, which is not why I decided to become a doctor in the first place. So.
Good afternoon, all. I would like to welcome you all to Enough is Enough, Breaking Through the Common Misconceptions Sickle Cell Disease Warriors Face. My name is Tanika Hoffman. I am the Executive Director of the Sickle Cell Coalition of Maryland. I was born in Washington, D.C., but currently reside in Prince George's County. I am a sickle cell warrior. I have genotype SC disease. I also have a master's in international development. I speak 3 languages, and I have a coffee shop in Thailand. I'm really excited to invite you all through this journey with our panelists, and we will begin with Nikki, and she will introduce herself to you all.
Hi, everyone. It's such an honor to be here because stigma is an important topic that we have to continue to discuss so we can really minimize the different perspectives and the poor outcomes that come from the judgment. So my name is Niclaine Paul. I was born in Haiti, came to the U.S. at 5. I was born to minister and a nurse, and I was diagnosed at about 1 year old with sickle cell disease, SS. And I was blessed to have a high fetal hemoglobin, and so therefore I do not experience crisis on an everyday typical basis. But with that, I have experienced ailments more in pediatric age than adult. And knowing that, I said, I want to be a nurse. My mom was a nurse, and so I went into nursing, really striving to care for the sickle cell population, to really understand not only what I go through, but why, right? It's the pathophysiology and also the social determinants of health and the care that is necessary to treat this very intricate population of patients. And so I'm a registered nurse. I went to nursing school and I transitioned from clinical side to case management to also help on the proactive end. How can we minimize inpatient admissions or outpatient care? But it was important to attend here to help to discuss this very important issue. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. I'm very excited to be here, a part of the International Conference on Stigma. I think it's really important that we sort of break the stigmas that have to do with sickle cell disease. I got diagnosed with sickle cell at birth. I have genotype SC as well. And so I only knew I had sickle cell disease. My parents only knew I had it at birth because Virginia required a newborn screening at the time. So other than that, I might have possibly had to live through pain for years without knowing what it was. So I'm really grateful that I was able to know at a young age. My journey with sickle cell started at about 5 years old when I had my first crisis. And at that time, it was so traumatic for me having people that didn't believe me and believe my pain and believe my struggles. And that stigma that's created around sickle cell disease, that we're seeking attention, that we just want to seek out drugs for no reason other than actually being in pain and actually requiring those medical needs and medical attention. So I definitely sort of grew up with that stigma around feeling like I wasn't able to advocate for myself for a long time. So at about 8 years old, I decided I wanted to bridge the gap between what sickle cell resources were provided versus other illnesses that I saw in the hospital, like oncology or cystic fibrosis. I saw those kids having a lot of resources, mental health and different health resources, having more monetary funds going into their illnesses, and I didn't see that same thing for sickle cell. So I wanted to change that at a very young age, and then fast forwarding to now, where I represent the Sickle Cell Disease Association of America as their national teen ambassador, and I'm also Miss Virginia's Outstanding Teen, and my platform for Miss America is having sickle cell awareness, chronic illness awareness. So I always use sickle cell disease as more of a, not just something that's holding me back, not something that's like a fork in my road, but I use it as something that can elevate my life and also help other people feel that they can do the same thing. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Jimmy Olahair. These days I don't consider myself a warrior anymore.
Still are.
Still are. I was born here in DC, although that's debatable. Tanika told me John Hopkins wasn't actually in DC in 1985, so I actually don't know if I was born in Maryland or DC. I'm still trying to figure it out. But grew up with sickle cell as well. Interesting story. My parents are of Nigerian heritage, and at the time in 1985, they didn't have that amniocentesis test you do to confirm what genetic disorder. And my mom was fortunate enough to come to DC, I think, or Maryland, I'm not sure. And I had the test, and I was basically diagnosed at birth. Looking back at that video is basically my life story in the past, going to hospitals and not having doctors believe you, and it was heartbreaking. And it actually became bad because I started self-medicating because I was so embarrassed to go to the hospital. But I got fortunate. My quality of life was really in the gutter at one point, and my parents really wanted me to figure out a way to improve my quality of life. And I didn't want to do a bone marrow transplant because, I'd done my research, I had heard bad stories, and I just didn't want to be absent, take that leave of absence from my life, even if my life wasn't that great. I just didn't want to do it. And to appease them,
Can you explain what a bone marrow transplant is for those who don't know what it is? Or would you like for me to do it?
Bone marrow transplant is a procedure you go through where they basically take someone else's who has a match. These days you can do it with not 100% match, but ideally you like to have someone who has the same bone marrow match as you. They will knock out your bone marrow through conditioning with chemotherapy like Belcifan and radiation, and they'll implant this new bone marrow that's been donated to you. And God willing, hopefully that match, that bone marrow has been a good match, and you'll start producing hemoglobin A as opposed to hemoglobin S, therefore curing your sickle cell disease. I'm not sure if I'm right about the stats, but I think it said it worked 60% of the time a while back when I did the research. But you have possibility of, getting things like graft and host disease and all. It was just, you had to take a lot of time out to really participate in the bone marrow transplant, and I didn't want to do that. But to appease my parents, I was doing some research and I found something called genetic engineering, gene editing, and that's what I was looking forward to, and I thought that was something still far in the future. So I told my parents, yes, I found this thing called gene editing and I'm going to do it probably 20, 50 years from now. And to my shock, 2 years after that, it was available. So the reason why I said I don't feel like a warrior these days, because I'm not in the trenches like my fellow warriors, is because I had the good fortune of participating in a clinical trial that used CRISPR-Cas9 to edit my DNA to switch on that fetal hemoglobin that she has produced.
Can you explain what fetal hemoglobin is for those who don't know?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So in utero, we all produce something called fetal hemoglobin, and it's hemoglobin F. It's really good hemoglobin because you're a baby. Babies need to stay healthy. And then once you're delivered, you stop producing this fetal hemoglobin. And you start producing either hemoglobin S, hemoglobin A, or in my situation, hemoglobin S. So what they did was they extracted my DNA and they found the allele that creates hemoglobin F, and they actually turned mine back on. So in addition to creating sickle-celled hemoglobin S, I'm also creating hemoglobin F again. And because I'm creating overwhelmingly more hemoglobin F, I don't feel the pain or the symptoms of sickle cell, even though I still have it. And I've been really fortunate that I was able to participate in that, and that's really changed my life. But there's still a lot of irreparable damages that sickle cell has already done to my life. Although I'm not in the trenches anymore, I still suffer from the consequences a bit.
Thank you so much. Before I sit down, I'm just going to go into a brief history of sickle cell disease and what it is. So let me take you back about 7,200 years ago, somewhere on the continent of Africa, where malaria runs rampant. One of our descendants' ancestors, their genetic gene switched from an A to an S. Depending on where you are in the world, it could be an A to a C or to thalassemia. The reason why our code changed is because malaria was wiping us out, and it was an evolutionary way for our body to protect against malaria. So if you have sickle cell trait, you're not as prone to catching malaria than those who don't. Now, it is a myth that sickle cell patients can't catch malaria. That is not true. We can catch malaria. And so we speed up over time, and we begin to see the transatlantic slave trade. We begin to see major populations from malaria-prone regions, which includes the Mediterranean. So your Italians, your Greeks, the Middle East. It includes, Oman and Saudi Arabia. And people begin to move all across the world and intermate, and you begin to see the production of sickle cell disease. Because when each parent holds a trait, there's a 1 in 4 chance with every pregnancy, or a 25% chance that you will have a child with sickle cell disease. And so, just a little note, it's very, very important to know what your trait status is while you are in reproductive years. And so we get to the United States and we go through slavery and we go through Jim Crow, and around this time children are still not making it past the age of 5 years old. And so sickle cell disease is actually officially diagnosed in 1910 when a student from Grenada came and they took a sample of his blood and noticed that some of the shapes were sickled. And so that's where sickle cell disease gets its name, from the sickling tool used in farming or to cut a grain. And fast forward, during the civil rights and into the 60s and 70s, we have the Black Panther. I'm just gonna pause just for a second until they shut the door. Thank you. And so as we're coming out of Jim Crow into the time of civil rights and the beginning of the Black Panther Party, they coined sickle cell disease the Black genocide. Because remember that 1910, people were only living to 5 years old. By the time we got to the 70s, people were still only making it to 5 years old. And so in their push to bring real resources, sustainable resources within the Black community, they took on the plight of sickle cell disease and began to do genetic mobile testing in the 70s. They not only did that, but they pushed the Nixon administration to create the 1974 Sickle Cell Disease Expansion Act, which introduced the United States to newborn screenings. And although all states did not adopt newborn screening, so it's a possibility you might not know you have sickle cell disease or trait depending on where in the country you were born, because the last state to adopt newborn screenings for sickle cell was Maine in 2006. They began to push our administration to have care clinics throughout the United States. However, after the Black Panther Party was disbanded, a lot of their work fell to the ground. And so then we had a new wave of researchers, especially here at Howard in the HUG study, where they were studying penicillin, and one of the reasons why many children wasn't making it past 5 years old is because us sickle cell warriors were more susceptible to bacterial infections in our blood. And so they realized if you administer prophylactically penicillin from the age of birth to 5 years old, children were making it out of that, very risky stage. Now, in developing countries on the continent of Africa, this is not true. Children are still dying at the age of 5, but in the Western world, we are beginning to make it to much greater ages. And so now we have penicillin, and then we move to the HUG study where St. Jude had a chemotherapy warrior who had sickle cell disease and chemotherapy, and what they realized is by giving a small dose of chemotherapy that it would help the body create fetal hemoglobin. And so the good thing about fetal hemoglobin is that there are these little baby cells, and they're bouncy like a normal cell. They're not like sickle cells in the sense where they're rigid and they can't, carry oxygen to, the bones, the organs. And what they begin to realize is this chemotherapy agent can help our S count, which basically just means the amount of sickle cells in our body decrease and that fetal hemoglobin to increase. And so they begin doing a study on this, and by the mid-90s, into the early 2000s, adults were given the opportunity to have hydroxyurea in their cabinets. And then a little bit later on, 10 years later, around 2013, children were then introduced to hydroxyurea. And right now, that medication is the only gold standard for sickle cell disease right now. It's the only medication that has proven to protect organs and also decrease sickling. Now, there is some caveat to hydroxyurea. Not a lot of people feel comfortable taking it because it is a chemotherapy agent. Not only that, 80% of medical providers, primary care providers in the United States do not feel comfortable administering hydroxyurea to sickle cell patients. They don't have the capacity, they don't have the time to monitor their labs and blood work, and so a lot of patients who should be on this medication is not. And fast forward to maybe about 2 years after 2013, another medication came onto the market called aglutamine, and it's basically, it's a professional name is Indari, and it basically helps to, allow the body to allow the cells to move more freely in the body. And so now that we're in 2022 into 2023, we're literally at the cusp of curing sickle cell disease. So my friend here, Jimmy, he is a walking testament of what our new world of science is going to look like. We're going to be able to cut DNA with Cas9 and turn off defects and literally cure people without them having a match. Because in bone marrow transplants, you need a sibling to be very closely matched. And only 20% of sickle cell warriors have siblings that match them. And so they're not even eligible for cures. And so now now we're in the world of Cas9 and gene editing that will offer the opportunity for warriors to be cured, starting in the West and then eventually all year around, all world around every year, which is great. But on top of that, we do have now other curative measures people are looking to outside of Cas9, and also medications. So right now, there are only 4 medications available to sickle cell patients. In the United States, there are over 100,000 individuals with sickle cell disease. We don't know, that's what we're guessing. But compared to CF, where there's only 30,000 patients and only affects about predominantly white people, they have a lot more resources. They get 16 times more funding than sickle cell disease patients. The average sickle cell disease patient, as far as research dollar, compared to CF patients, receive $500 to $800. Cystic fibrosis patients receive $2,500 per head in research. They have over 20 medications. They have networks and clinics throughout the entire country where they can go into a center and receive care like that. Sickle cell patients, because there are not enough benign hematologists going into the field, 9 times out of 10 have to receive their care in the ER. And unfortunately, care in the ER for a sickle cell patient is not a safe place. That's where we get the majority of stigma in sickle cell disease. And so I can tell my personal story. There has been countless times where I would come, to an ER and it would be, you're here for drugs. Literally in your chart, drug addict, drug seeker, here for drugs. We'll give you your dose and then we'll kick you out of the hospital. I mean, patients are literally having the police called on them in the ER and they're being dragged out. And this happens as soon as patients turn 18. As soon as you transition out of pediatrics, you're not cute anymore, you're not adorable, you are an African American man or woman or a Latino or a person of color, because sickle cell disease predominantly affects individuals of color, although white people can have sickle cell as well. But you're not cute anymore, and they don't care. And so I like to say, go slam your finger in a car door repeatedly, and that's what sickle cell disease feels like. And so you're in this space where you're being ignored, and you're just hoping that someone will believe you, and you live this until you die. And so it's very important for us to speak about these things. We're gonna sit down and have a great conversation with our panelists, but I just wanted to give you all a brief history of sickle cell disease in the United States and globally, where we came from and where we're going. Thank you. So, Ayana, can you talk to me about what it's like being a sickle cell warrior and going to school day to day? What does it look like managing, your classes, your homework, your social life, being Miss Teen Virginia while having a chronic illness with one of the primary symptoms being extreme fatigue? Like, what does your day, your world look like? Bring the audience into your world.
So I've always been actually a very active and busy kid. That was a part of my family's goal for me to always be active and sort of not ponder on having sickle cell disease. I never really had time to sit and just think about, I have sickle cell disease, I'm scared about when I'm gonna get sick, because I was always involved in activities that I enjoyed doing, and my parents continued to encourage that throughout my academic career. And I'm a dancer, I'm a classically trained violinist, so I've always been really active in my community with different activities and projects, just things that I enjoy doing. But it was also really important for me to get protection at school. I had to make sure I had a 504 plan, because teachers sometimes would not be the most understanding about the extra requirements that I needed to have for sickle cell disease. And even if it was explained to them, they just didn't want to understand it, or sometimes I would even go as far to embarrass me in front of other students. So it really was about making sure I was protected so I could get the best education possible. Having those extra accommodations in place has really aided me in school. Having to go to the bathroom more frequently because I need to stay hydrated or I can get sick, or making sure I take breaks if needed. Sometimes, sickle cell can just be unpredictable. So if I happen to have a crisis in class, making sure I'm able to be accommodated to go and get my heating pad or do whatever I need to do, making sure I get more bottles of water, eating snacks, things like that. But day to day, it can be a struggle to make sure I feel my best and do my best at the same time, since I am so busy and involved with the Miss America organization as a state title holder. So I have those responsibilities too, that I want to do my job all the way. So it's definitely difficult to make sure I'm managing my body. And I go to Governor's School for the Arts, so I'm dancing every day, about 15 plus hours a week. That's rehearsals and things like that for concerts, show preparation, and then now I'm getting ready to go to Connecticut for a Miss America event. So it's a lot usually from day to day, and making sure I'm taking care of my body is the most important thing. So icing or heat mostly is the thing that I do the best with. Heated blankets are my best friend, definitely after a long day of dance and activity. I would say just medicating too when it gets cold outside, when we have like those weather changes, especially in Virginia, the weather can just be very wishy-washy. So if I know that the weather is going to drop at a certain interval, I definitely medicate Tylenol and take Celebrex to make sure that I don't get sick, just to be preventative. So having a preventative lifestyle has definitely been how I stay the most healthy, making sure I had a balanced diet from a young age. My mom made my baby food for me so I could have a good diet from a young age, and now I'm a kid that enjoys eating fruits and vegetables. That's something I just enjoy doing from day to day. I enjoy being active. So having all those things put in place from a young age has definitely aided me in how I live my life now, and it being a normal thing for me to live a healthy lifestyle and to live a preventative lifestyle.
I think that is wonderful. You are very much so the poster child, because unfortunately with the majority of warriors your age, between 18 and 25, that's actually the most dangerous time of their lives. Research is now showing that we're actually losing years every year because of the stigma within the medical community, even the stigma within our families, and then the stigma of people not knowing what sickle cell disease is, not having an interest in sickle cell disease, not fighting for sickle cell disease compared to other diseases. And it isn't necessarily like a comparison of, our disease is better or bigger in any way. It's just that sickle cell disease does not get the deserved attention that's due. So Jimmy, can you tell me a little about what your day-to-day looks like, from being a business owner, even from the side of healing once you were cured? Because what we know is as you get older with sickle cell disease, you sustain damage. And so damage means, for example, in my case, both of my hip bones are dead, both of my shoulder bones are dead, my spleen died. I literally just got out of the hospital 2 days ago. I've been in for 3 weeks, and I've been running ever since. But that means that, our bodies are not getting that oxygen. We're literally being starved from the inside out of air. So when you hear, the phrase, I can't breathe, our bodies literally cannot breathe. And so Jimmy, can you talk to us a little about what your day-to-day looked like pre and post clinical trial?
Absolutely. So, pre-transplant, it was tough, really tough. I like to use this analogy of a car that you're just constantly in the second gear, but you have the ability to get to the fourth and the fifth gear, but you can't do that. You have to kind of live a life of maintenance when you're in constant maintenance mode. So it's really not pushing myself, similar to Ayana, being she calls it preventative. I was very paranoid. Everything used to freak me out. I basically sheltered myself, like a bubble boy in a way. And it was difficult because I had all these ambition of things I wanted to do. I felt like life was passing by and I was just a passenger. And I couldn't really do anything physically. It completely wrecked my body. I have bilateral avascular necrosis as well. And in my line of work, I decided to focus on technology businesses in order to make sure I keep my body as healthy as possible for as long as I can. And at my day-to-day pre-transplant, I'll wake up in the morning and start my day. I was in so much pain that I would start my day with 10 milligrams of Dilaudid.
That sounds like me sometimes.
Without even eating. That's how much I was. It was a constant in my life, pain medication. I would start my day like that, and I would really let sickle cell control me and take me where it wants to go during that day, kind of like a puppet master in a way.
Right.
So if I'm feeling good after that first round of pain medication, I decide to, see what's next on the agenda. How much can I get done before this
you're always
wears
racing.
off? Exactly.
You're always racing because you don't know when your next crisis is. Yeah, it is very much so like that. I was going to ask you a question, and so I'm not at as of a higher dose of pain medication that you were at, but nonetheless, I still have to wake up and take a narcotic just to be able to do what I do, right? Has there been any stigma within your family or judgment with, oh my gosh, like you're literally taking 10 milligrams of Dilaudid every morning. You are what the hospitalists, what the ER doctors say you are a drug addict. Have you encountered that or know of anyone who's been in that situation, but at the end of the day, that's the only way you can function?
Yeah, I've encountered it within the confines of my doctors, they'll get into, and to be fair, I kind of get the point because we were at the stage where the opioid crisis was burgeoning. Unfortunately, we bear the brunt of it. But my doctors would tell me, hey, listen, I think you're taking too much pain medication that I think I have to recommend you to a pain doctor. That's how bad it'll get. And then I'll get to the pain specialist, and there is where I was truly stigmatized because back then, 50%, at least in my opinion, from what I was seeing, 50% of the people that were seeking pain medication, I'm not sure they really needed it from the hospitals I used to visit. So I kind of was painted with a broad brush like everyone else that was there visiting. Those, oh, we know what you're here for, just take it and go. So that was very, very difficult. So yeah, it wasn't easy, but continuing to just trying to continue my day with that disease, like I said, it was really just allowing the disease take me where it wanted to go during that specific day. And it was never really just, it really takes another toll on you mentally because you are, one, dealing with this disease that no one really can see. It's kind of an invincible disease, and
we all look normal on this stage. You would never know.
Yeah, and inside, your body is literally falling apart. And that's what it was like pre-transplant, and then post-transplant, the change was unbelievable. I think I don't even think I'm at my full capacity yet, but about probably, I would say 5 to 6 months after transplant. Before the transplant, I had this thing I called painsomnia, where I couldn't sleep. I was just in so much pain. I just took naps. My life was just naps when there was no sleeping. And after the transplant, I could go to bed, wake up early. As a matter of fact, I didn't even want to stay in bed because it felt like I was drinking a Red Bull every time I woke up. I was just so energized. The amount of energy I had compared to what I had before, it was just astounding to me. And I was almost sad in a way that this is what I'm supposed to be. This is what life is supposed to be.
Normal people live with.
This is what normal life is, and I haven't lived an ounce of that until 36 years, So it was, in a way, kind of depressing. I had to actually fight myself out of that to still say, hey, in the grand scheme of things, you're still a young guy, so you still have a lot of time. But yeah, post-transplant, it's unbelievable, extremely active. Now the first thing I do when I wake up is I go rowing.
That's amazing.
I'm an avid rower, so that's literally what I do. I'm able to do physical activity like I couldn't before, and it's surreal.
I think this is a good segue for Nikki because she is a provider. Nikki, can you talk about Jimmy was talking about the fatigue. Can you enlighten our attendees on the average life of a red blood cell, how you made it through as a nurse. Nikki was actually the nurse in the video that you all just watched. How did you make it all day at Johns Hopkins treating sickle cell patients, and where are you at now, and some of the ways you've had to, reserve your energy as you're getting older and sickle cell is becoming more prominent in your life?
Sure. So when you're born with sickle cell disease, what happens is you have a point mutation where your hemoglobin is sickled. So much like the farm instrument, that's where it's a sickled shape, and so therefore normal red blood cells have a lifespan of about 120 days. With sickle cell, because of this mutation from the bone, from the red blood cell that gets destructed, or what we call hemolyzes, and it becomes crescent shaped, sickle shaped, and so it's not able to freely pass through the blood vessels. And so what happens is the average age of a sickle red blood cells is about 15 to 20, which is a massive difference. And what happens is hemoglobin is a protein that helps to carry oxygen throughout all parts of your body. And so with that, oxygen is much like food, right? And so with the lack of oxygen, we have, really a tough time, especially with pain being the hallmark symptom, because beyond the point where the cells become sickled and aggregate together, you have less oxygen flowing beyond that point. And so that's where the pain begins, which leads to a lot of other complications throughout your organs, your bones, your skin. And so one of the things that I like to explain when you're speaking of fatigue is because of that lack of oxygen. A scenario I'll put out is, let's say a typical day, we have to really understand what our day looks like with sickle cell, right? If my family says, okay, let's go to Six Flags, for example, there are various triggers that a day of Six Flags can, help to manifest this sickle crisis or vaso-occlusive crisis. And the common triggers are dehydration, right? For example, who's paying $20 for water, right? Dehydration, is that better? Okay. Dehydration, infection, overexertion, stress, whether it's physical or mental, can contribute to, again, this sickling process, which then leads to the complications. So when we talk about fatigue, it's because we have that lack of oxygen going through. So someone typically would live at about a hemoglobin level of 13 to 15. In sickle cell, we can average, especially with genotype SS, which is considered the most common and most severe, you live at about anywhere, and everybody is different, right? But you live at about a 7 to 8. And others can live even lower than that,
and not to cut
baseline.
And not to cut you off, but we were talking about this earlier before you came upstairs. Can you explain to everyone what a genotype is? So in the beginning, I introduced myself as sickle cell SC. You introduced yourself as sickle cell I'm so sorry, it's so hard to talk over that. You introduced yourself as having sickle cell disease, high persistent fetal hemoglobin. And Jimmy, you said you were SS, correct?
SS.
And now you're AS. So can you explain to the audience what those genotypes are, and in comparison of them, are they the same? Are they different?
They are different. So we are born with types of hemoglobin, right? And that is, you have your A, which is your typical, your normal, and you have S, which is the sickled, where the gene is mutated, and then you have C, and you also have beta thalassemia. Now, those combinations can, again, from parents being passed down genetically, you have various types that can, manifest into the full sickle cell disease. So like I mentioned before, SS, you have the genotype where there are 2 trait individuals that came with S to have the combination of SS, and an individual can have a C, hereditary C genotype, and not know it, right? And have a child with someone who has S trait, and now you have someone that is born with SC disease and S beta thalassemia. So really, we're talking about the different types within, we're talking about the different types within the blood cell.
Yes, most definitely. And so that is why people sometimes get thrown off when they are diagnosed with other genotypes.
Correct.
So when you hear the term sickle cell anemia, that's one genotype, which is SS. But sickle cell disease is an umbrella, and under the umbrella is these different genotypes. Example, my cell sickle and the C crystallizes. So you have a crystallization process also happening. Can you explain to them what's happening with beta thalassemia?
Yes, same, really the same. So beta thalassemia, you have null and plus. And so when you have beta thalassemia plus, you tend to have more manifestations, complicated. Now, no two individuals are the same, and it's hard to say. We were actually just having this conversation, right? How if you have SC, then we're going to expect you to have less complications, right?
Not true.
You tend to have more of the eye concerns because oxygen is carried to various parts of your body, right? Whether it's skin, all organs can have their complications due to the lack of oxygen. And so when you have S beta thalassemia, it's just another type of sickle cell that also carries. When you have null, you are more similar tied to SS, and when you have plus, you're more similarly tied to SC.
Yes.
Correct.
So just remember in conversation that sickle cell anemia is just one form of sickle cell disease.
Exactly.
So we don't want to hold up the time, but I wanted to ask you all a couple of more questions. And anyone could just feel free. We can do popcorn. Let's try to keep our answers small and short so that we can get to a Q&A with the audience. So my question right now is, what is your biggest challenge at this stage in your life of having sickle cell disease? I'll go really quickly. I own a coffee shop in Thailand. Technically, you shouldn't be flying very long hours overseas. And I haven't been to Thailand in 4 years because my sickle cell has been out of this world. But that is my challenge right now, getting back to Thailand.
I think for me, it's career. When I went into nursing, I was bedside nurse, and so there's a lot of physical exertion that comes with caring for someone at the bedside, and so I transitioned to try to remotely work, whether it's case management, and now I consult. So I launched my my consulting company, Sickle Care Solutions, to help clinicians, the public, really understand the disease, and also help clinicians open up their own dedicated centers for the care of this population of patients. And because we know we rely on the emergency room, but it is a much better and safer space to have a dedicated comprehensive center, infusion really, where we can provide the care. And so for me, it was that transition away from the bedside.
And then just a small insert. In our area, Johns Hopkins is the only comprehensive sickle cell center in our region for adults.
Yes, there are only about 12 nationwide comprehensive wraparound centers. I helped to open up the Sickle Cell Infusion Center at Johns Hopkins in 2008. And so we're really actively working with the American Society for Hematology to help groups of clinicians, again, open up their own infusion clinics nationwide.
Not to be very long-winded, but 2 weeks ago, a little over 2 weeks, 3 weeks, Senator Cory Booker, Senator Chris Van Hollen just introduced the Sickle Cell Cares and Treatment Act for $539 million dedicated specifically to sickle cell disease every year. 70% of that new bill would be dedicated to a Johns Hopkins Center of Excellence to do a spokes and a hub and spokes model. Yes, and so the hub would be Johns Hopkins, and then the spoke would be any community hospital that needs services and are treating sickle cell disease. And then 30% would go to any sickle cell CBOs or organizations. So please reach out to your representatives and delegates and say, yes, I vote for the Sickle Cell Disease Comprehensive Act and the Sickle Cell Disease Expansion Act, which will be paying any person who goes into hematology full ride scholarships. So those are two bills that have just been introduced this summer. Sorry, Ayana.
So for me, sickle cell, the hardest struggle living with it right now is probably just being a high school student and also being Miss Virginia's Outstanding Teen, being involved in all the things I'm involved in. I'm taking honors classes and college classes now as a junior in high school. So being a junior in high school and also like a freshman in college is difficult and sometimes can be stressful for me, having those highly weighted classes. And I'm very strict on myself and hard on myself a lot of the times when it comes to my academics, so that can cause me to be stressed more often than not. So just keeping the stress level down is really important, and then also the aspect of being Miss Virginia's Outstanding Teen and making sure I want to be really active in my role, since it is for the betterment of people with sickle cell disease. So I'm really passionate about it, and that's why I want to do a lot of things, a lot of different appearances, a lot of different events, but also just making sure I'm okay, physically, mentally, emotionally. It can be really difficult to sort of balance all of that out, and my job can definitely vary. Sometimes I might be at a parade and I might just have to wave at the back of a car. Sometimes I'm talking to kids, and so I have to keep that full attention with them and making sure that they feel special when Miss Virginia's Outstanding Teen is talking to them. So wearing like 5-inch heels all day and then walking around with the kids, and also can vary from going to hospitals or talking to legislators. It really just varies and really depends. So making sure I'm taking care of myself, balancing all of that out is really probably the most difficult part about living with sickle cell in this phase of my life right now.
For me, the most difficult thing I'm facing living with sickle cell right now is probably trying to figure out who I am post-transplant. I'm going through this identity crisis of living with the disease for 35 years, and then one day you wake up, it's kind of gone, so you kind of get lost. So that was a challenge that I did not expect, but yeah, that's my biggest one right now.
Yes, we hear that a lot with those who are cured, and let me put it out there is no cure for sickle cell disease right now. But for those who are cured, they have an identity crisis issue, so I know that could be very difficult. Your whole life, you're in pain, you're stigmatized, and then you're like, oh, I'm normal. Like, how do you live day to day being normal now? Yeah, so I totally get that. Can you all just really quickly talk about your access to care? How easy is it for you to access care currently, or how difficult it is? And why do you think that is? I'll go last this time. Jimmy, you want to start?
Sure, I'll start it. So I've been actually fortunate to experience living with sickle cell in 3 different continents, in Africa, where my parents are from, in the UK, where I lived for a little bit, and here in the US. And for me, I think moving to the, I guess because I'm seeing it from different perspective, I think the access to care here is fantastic compared to what I had in Nigeria as a young toddler. I remember in school, I used to do this weird thing where when the teacher leaves, I would run to the front of the class and I'll steal the chalk and I'll take it home with me. And when my mom isn't looking, I'll go into the couch and I'll start ripping out foam and I'll put it in my pocket and I'll go to,
Pika.
And I'll start eating it. And in Nigeria, they thought I was crazy. And I thought I was crazy too. And I moved to the US and I find out it's something called Pika. And so to me, that made the access to care seem a lot better than what I had been used to.
For me, I'm very blessed to be in the position that I was in, having access to healthcare, having full access to get the medication that I needed. So now Indari is something that Tanika discussed earlier that I'm able to take, and having insurance to be able to pay for that, because it can be very expensive just getting regular medications for sickle cell disease that you need to live, to wake up the next day. And that being priced so high, I think is something that our country definitely...
It's $4,000 every month for Indari, and also for the 2 new medications, Oxybrita, it's $100,000 a year, and for Dacvio, it's $120K. Keep in mind, the majority of sickle cell patients are on Medicaid and Medicare.
Yes, so it's very expensive to pay for those medications that we need to live from day to day. But having the access to those medications and not having to pay that much money out of pocket has been very helpful for me in having sickle cell disease, so I can make sure I have the tools I need to stay as healthy as possible. And also just being able to go to all of my doctor's appointments, being able to go to get my labs done, and seeing what I can do to improve my health overall has been really fortunate thing of mine, that I've been able to have access to that for my entire life.
For me, access to care on the clinician perspective is something that we're really trying to improve every day. Because we only have comprehensive centers in about 12 different locations, when you speak of rural areas, and access to care needs to improve because we have a long way to go. We have made strides, but we do have a long way to go, especially when you speak of the hub and spoke wheel. We're really trying to increase the comprehensive care that patients are able to seek. Now, traditionally, we've had to rely on the emergency room, as we've stated before. And because there's not a specialized understanding of what the disease really needs and the stigma that comes from, have it be the opioid epidemic or, the lack of understanding, and really pain is not visible, right? I can't read the vital machine to say, oh, you're in 8 out of 10 pain. I have to believe what it is you say because there is no objective measure. I cannot look at lab values to say, oh, this individual is really in a pain crisis, right? It's a familiarity that comes with a comprehensive center and a specialized team that understands your needs and the complications that this disease really brings about. And so for us, we're just really, again, like I said, really trying to increase the comprehensive care, because being an individual living with sickle cell disease, much like we've stated, going into emergency room, having to think through what you're gonna say, how you're gonna dress, right? Okay, I can't be too loud, I can't cry too much, or I can't, express myself too aggressively as far as what it is I need.
I can't be on my phone.
Correct.
I can't be eating.
And one of the things that, from a nurse perspective and working amongst nurses and having to increase that knowledge is because we already have a low amount of areas that we can seek out care. Now, when we have to rely on individuals in the emergency room, right, it's the language, right, it's the nonverbal, verbal, right, and hearing someone, and it still brings my hairs up in the back of my neck when I hear the word sickler, right, and it's just really not only self-advocating, but it's also up to every single individual to say, you know what, this is the right way. And American Society for Emergency Physicians is also bringing about, a manual for how to care for this specific patient population. And they're improving because there needs to be an understanding that the first dose of pain medication has better outcomes when it's given within the first hour, right? But when we have delayed in care because you may not believe I'm in pain for whatever reason, I'm sitting in a wheelchair in an emergency room for 2 to 3 hours, and now that increases the likelihood that I'm gonna have to be admitted, right? So when I helped open up the Sickle Cell Infusion Center in 2008, prior to that, we had over 40% of individuals from who sought care in the emergency room that either were discharged home or admitted, which either way sometimes was incorrect, right? Because if you have safe and aggressive care, really providing the amount of pain management that's necessary and the thoroughness and the understanding of what to look for, then we have the ability to turn it around. And so the comprehensive center, the infusion center, we dropped the admission rate down to about 12%, right? Because we were able to, in a day, really stay on top of the pain management. And so that's why access to care needs to improve, and that's why it's so important to not only advocate for ourselves, but also have community mobilization for advocacy, because that's what brings about change, to have institutional buy-in, right? Because we're encountering systemic racism, right? And it's institutional, and it is deep deeply layered. And so that's where the stigma really comes from, right? It's a lack of understanding, the fear of what am I exactly, how exactly, right? Because I may appear one way, but there's many other complications that could be happening that is being overlooked because, the understanding is just not there. And so that's why these conferences are important.
Can I just kind of add on a little bit to what she is saying? That I like how you use the term familiarity, because you're the only one who knows if you're going through a sickle cell crisis, and that's a very difficult concept to explain to someone. And I feel sometimes when I'm having a crisis, I just feel this frustration, because it's like I can't fully explain to you how it feels. And then even when my doctors or providers are asking me, well, how does this feel? Sometimes I'm like, I just don't know.
That's very
and
true.
I just feel lost in the whole thing. And having that stigma of adults not believing you throughout my entire experience, or doctors not believing your pain, and you're supposed to be medically educated on this, and you're supposed to understand, I'm thinking you're gonna understand what I'm going through, and I'm thinking you're gonna understand that pain, and then it's like you're not even being empathetic towards me having this excruciating pain that I'm going through. I had a kindergarten teacher, when I explained briefly at the beginning my first crisis when I was 5 years old, and I'm thinking I can trust this person that I'm going to, telling her that I'm having excruciating pain. I didn't even know that it was a sickle cell crisis because it was my first time having a sickle cell crisis, and I just knew I was in a lot of pain, and I didn't know why, and I didn't know what it was, but I knew it felt different. So my reaction was to just scream, and my reaction was to cry, and then I just started to play with toys, because that's how I distracted myself. And having early development childcare, you learn that that's how kids distract themselves from pain. They play. And so then when my mom heard about how she reacted and just told me, you're fine, she was so upset, and my dad was really upset as well. And then the comment is always, well, she doesn't look sick. My parents are like, well, how is my daughter supposed to look having sickle cell disease? How does that look? Having sickle cell, it looks different on everyone. Because now today I feel great and have zero pain, but then the next day I could be at a 10 and I might just be disguising it because of all these experiences I've had of people shutting me down continuously.
Exactly. And sickle cell disease is a blood disorder. It's actually the most common blood disorder, genetic blood disorder. And for us to still be grossly underfunded and still have a lack of specialized care, right? Because hematologists are the blood doctors, right? But only a fraction of hematologists actually specialize or treat individuals with sickle cell disease.
Because there's no money in it.
Correct, right? Cancer brings in more money and funding. And so, it's just understanding to that level that we really have to, do better.
I agree.
Do better.
Very much so to your point, Ayana. I get so irritated when a doctor asks me, what is your pain on the scale of 1 to 10? Sickle cell disease does not fit on a scale of 1 to 10. Like, I always get so perplexed and look at them stupidly like, really? Like, maybe if I stub my toe, we could do like 1 to 10, but a full-on vaso-occlusive crisis, in my lungs, right, which is acute chest syndrome, which is the leading cause of death in sickle cell patients, or I'm getting no oxygen to my spleen, which just happened literally over the last 3 weeks, and there's infarcts everywhere, How do you put that on a scale of 1 to 10, And so to leave room for questions, I'm just gonna ask each of the panelists to leave you all with one phrase, a saying, or anything that they would like very shortly. And then we will hand the mic out for questions.
Phrase or saying, I think for me it's just really, just to, I know it's easier said than done when we get those words of, there's light at the end of the tunnel. I remember a lot of people used to tell me that too before the transplant, and I used to hate that. So I feel kind of hypocritical because I feel like that's what I'm going to say too, because there is, with gene editing, now they're even doing base editing where they go in there and actually edit the sickle cell DNA, and now you won't even have sickle cell anymore. So to be very hypocritical, yes, there is, at least for once, really true bright lights at the end of the tunnel, not just for sickle cell, but for genetic diseases as a whole. So, I mean, that really gives me a lot of hope.
I would say living is the cure. This is actually a phrase that I heard from somebody at an appearance that I did this past year, and I sort of took it with me, and I think it's something that's going to stick with me forever. Just living my life to the fullest extent has been what's helped me get through sickle cell disease. And the days where I felt like I couldn't get up and couldn't get out of bed, I remembered the moments where I was dancing in the studio, I was performing on stage, I was playing the violin, or I was going to speak about my social impact initiative. So I just feel like living your life, the best of your abilities, having sickle cell disease, is what's going to get you through.
We have to combine medicine, advocacy, and compassion. I feel like a lot of times compassion is out the door when it comes to the care. And so with that, we can bridge rapport and understanding and really close that gap, that care gap, because there's no reason why someone who transitions from pediatrics to adult, where there's such a lack of resources, says, once I transitioned out of pediatric, I feel like I transitioned out of life. Right? And so we need to just bring the compassion back and the belief in what someone says as opposed to what you believe because of your unconscious bias or your lack of understanding.
Well said. My last thought is sickle cell patients are called warriors, and so I would ask all of you all to join the Army, participate with your local sickle cell organization. Again, we have 2 new bills that are, introduced. We need support. Please reach out to your congressmen, women, your delegates, your representatives. This is going to be over $100 million every year for sickle cell patients. It's literally picking up where the Black Panthers stopped in the 1974 bill. And so would you join our Army? Would you be our voices? Sometimes we're too tired to be our own voice. I always say, I feel like cancer patients, they always get a voice. They can have the opportunity to heal and rest. But when it's sickle cell patients, we just have to constantly fight. We don't get the privilege of going into a hospital room and being at ease because we know that we're going to encounter at least one doctor who's going to not believe you. Like last week, I'm at Hopkins. Hopkins has an amazing system for sickle cell patients, but it's always that one doctor that will come in thinking they know about sickle cell and go and change all of what you've been on and steady in the system, and then you get even worse. And then the sickle cell team has to come up and correct the mess that they've done. And so if you're in the world as, psychiatrists, practitioners, nurses, wherever you are in your particular profession, just please think about sickle cell patients. We're not thought of. September was Sickle Cell Awareness Month. Where were the commercials? Where were the walks? Howard did have a walk, but from a national perspective, where was the national attention for sickle cell versus in October is Breast Cancer Awareness Month and it's pink everywhere? How is that possible, especially in the Black community where 1 in 365 births results in a child having sickle cell disease? So I would leave the audience with that, and I think someone already has the mic to ask their first question.
Yeah, I have a quick question. I'm the audio engineer, but my son was actually diagnosed with sickle cell SC. And I didn't realize until you were just talking how many stigmas I had leading up to it. And I had 4 children, and I remember every single time they asked me to take a blood test for sickle cell. And I remember every time I was like, nah, I'm good, I don't got that. I didn't even think about it. I didn't know what it was. I knew Prodigy had it or some people on TV had it, but I didn't even think about it until my 4th child was born with sickle cell. And now I'm going through the doctors and I'm hearing about hemoglobin and I'm hearing about hydroxyl. First he was on penicillin for 4 years, and now we're preparing to go on hydroxyl. And I went through that whole conversation of not knowing what they're talking about. And it's kind of scary because they're telling you, check for the liver and the kidneys and this and that. And at the same time, I'm still not even really understanding really what's going on, even though it's in our community. One is, how do we teach our community? Because like I said, I ignored it for 4 years, not even realizing I had a trait, and here I go with a child. And then the second question is, for all of you, like as a parent, how do I, or what is it that my child would want me to understand and know? Because back to those stigmas, it's already been times that I'm like, I had to catch myself because he's like, oh, I'm tired, or he's been outside for 20 minutes and he's back inside, but his brother's not. So I'm going in my brain like, is he being lazy right now? Do I need to push him a little bit more?
No.
He doesn't like to run as much. He had 2 situations, and both times I took him on me. I took him to the pool. I took him out the pool. I didn't change his clothes right away.
That's a no-no.
I didn't change his clothes right away. That night, I'm thirsty. I already gave you something to drink. I don't want you to pee the bed. He woke up in the morning in a crisis. So, I mean, those little things I'm already learning. So what is it that you can tell me to be prepared for? Like, you've already said some things like, all right, hydroxia, all right, I'm on it. They already talking about it. The insurance has been an issue, finding different carriers that can handle the different medicines. I mean, there's different forms of hydroxia. So, it's been different companies and different manufacturers trying to figure out.
Same drug, different manufacturers.
Yeah, so trying to figure out which one can carry my insurance. So I'm dealing with that. And, the liver test, learning all that. And then you say the genetics. They talked about that. The bone marrow, they talked about that. So I'm hearing all this stuff that I have no clue about, that I'm learning a little bit about. But there is no programming and education out here that's just, I'm not going to say it's not readily available, because if you look for it, you can find it, but it's not in my face the same way as everything else is.
I think you already answered your question. It's education. Like, we need to educate the masses again when it comes to sickle cell disease. Again, when the Black Panther Party was, disbanded, we lost all of those gains, all of that knowledge. But we are in a very unique time right now in sickle cell disease, because sickle cell disease is the carrying disease for gene editing. The world is now focused on our disease for the first time ever. I would say, I'm not for sure where you live, but get in the groove, get connected to your local sickle cell association, CBO, nonprofit, because they will help you understand sickle cell. And if your child is at a great sickle cell hospital, reach out to that social worker. That social worker or community health worker, they're there to help you learn the disease. I will say that it will not happen overnight. As your child is learning his triggers, so what you were explaining is a trigger. So he was triggered by jumping into a cold pool, because sickle cell patients cannot jump or get into a cold pool. It has to be a certain temperature. If not, our cells sickle and our veins constrict and we go into crisis. So you just have to grow with your son, learn his triggers, walk with him, and get a good support team. Your family, your friends, your bros, like, bring them into your world so that they can learn and they can identify, and they will not feel ashamed of getting a test to see if they have sickle cell trait or sickle cell sickle cell trait or AC or any other hemoglobinopathy traits that are persistent in all of us around the world. Did anybody want to add?
I think one of the key things that my parents helped me to understand is, from a very young age, is understanding your disease and understanding yourself. And from pediatrics, I remember, the provider would ask my mom, how has she been doing? Oh, no, you ask her. Right? And so therefore, you're able to learn from a very young age how to self-advocate and speak up for what you need. I think that's key as a parent. Just really, again, get plugged in, because there are support groups, there are education forums, there are things that you can do to really, gain that knowledge. But from a very young age, I think that was key, and that was pivotal to really helping me to understand how to care for myself, is because from a young age, I was allowed, or I was really encouraged to speak for myself, even during doctor's appointments.
And then I would say also, we can plug you in afterwards. We can find out where you live and connect you to resources.
I would say, I'm just going to quickly insert this so we can have time for more questions, but I feel like Nikki and I are on like the same wavelength, kind of having that exact same discussion with my mom. And from a very young age, she taught me all of my medications. She's like, okay, this is what you need to know. So if somebody asks you, you know what medications you take. Or when I go into the hospital, I know that I need Atarax with my Dilaudid so I don't get super itchy and then get even more irritated with pain and frustration. So having things like that you need to know that your child has, those triggers that he has, and then encouraging him to advocate for himself so that he learns how to advocate. He's learning himself, but you're learning as well with him. So I think that's a good way you can both sort of learn together, and making sure you're listening to him, seeing what does trigger him, and making sure you're being cognizant of that.
And in regards to parenting, I think for me, having parents that I felt pushed and protected me, I think you're going to have to find a balancing. It's a balance. You know, there were certain instances where I was pushed and I was like, wow, I'm really glad you guys pushed me to do that. I really enjoyed that. And there were moments where I was protected, where if I had participated in said activity, something worse could have happened. So the more you spend time with your son and you're learning, you're going to find the balance of when to push and when to protect.
Yeah, be okay with saying no. Like there were times where the weather was not hot enough and my friends was swimming and my mom would say, no, you cannot get in the pool. The temperature is not right now. I want you to be able to go to school this week. So again, it's all about balance, and also believe your child. If your child says that they're in pain, believe them, because there are medical providers who will tell you your child is lying, he's malingering, he's not in as much pain as he say. It's mental. So always believe your son. Next question. You're welcome.
Thank y'all for being here. I've had the privilege to work in the field of sickle cell as a case manager. I had the privilege to work in sickle cell as a case manager for 4 years in Louisiana, and I covered 8 counties. And one of the hardest things I had to learn is that you all are in pain, because I went from HIV to working in sickle cell. So I had to get used to the language, had to get used to the medicine, and I worked at the children's clinic. And one of the things about Louisiana is one of the poorest states when it comes to health care. And so I worked 8 counties. It was one doctor. They covered the whole 8 counties. It was one doctor. All the children in all the 8 counties had to see one doctor. And when I learned about hydroxyurea and the expense of it, and I said, how can they afford, $25,000 a month, what the pain, with the Lortabs, with the morphine drops, with the Dilaudid, with the Oxycontin, can you actually give a child that much medication?
You can.
Yeah, I know it. I learned that you can. But when I had to do the Make-A-Wish Foundation, and I'm grateful for y'all sitting here, that was one of the hardest decisions, for me to make, because it wasn't my child, and the parents say, I want my child to be happy. I want my child to have this wish. I want my child to go to Disney World. Coming from a person living with HIV for 31 years, and the lack of funding and the lack of exposure that you all get, thank y'all for the work you do. And one of the things that I try to do during Juneteenth is that I'm not from Texas.
Can you explain to them the significance of Juneteenth, please?
Juneteenth is World Sickle Cell Day.
Yes, it is.
And a lot of times we'll celebrate Juneteenth and we don't celebrate World Sickle Cell Day. And I think that should be brought into the equation, because I know you all want freedom from sickle cell.
Yes.
And that's a freedom day for you all. And I think you all should be included in Juneteenth, or begin to have your own parade separately. I was able to get motorcycle groups to ride for you all on World Sickle Cell Day instead of riding in the Juneteenth event. And I think that would be a great awareness for you all on Juneteenth. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we are, is there any other question? Just a very quick comment, and I really want those who have affected people with sickle cell disease to hear it. I have lived with sickle cell as a provider for 46 years.
Yes, that's amazing.
That's a minute, right? When there were no drugs, there was no penicillin, to the time that we had probably the 3 biggest advances happened during my tenure, during my training as sickle cell provider. And one of them was penicillin. Number 2 was TCD, transcranial Doppler, in prevention of stroke. And number 3 was hydroxyurea. And we conducted some of the most important trials, baby hug. All I can say is, gentlemen, I'm sorry I didn't get your name. You described your experience with transplant. I've had patients with sickle cell disease have the same experience with hydroxyurea. Where them coming back and say, the first few patients I started, I said, you haven't been coming to the clinic. He said, oh, your office has been renewing my medication. I said, but you need to be checked. I said, Dr. I don't feel like I have sickle cell disease anymore, because I take my medications regularly, and that's the crux of it. I mean, it's a reality that 50% of the population, no matter what you do, they'll not take their medication regularly.
Exactly.
They took 2 pills and they come back and, oh, it didn't work for me, you know? So, or whatever else. And they have swallowed nothing negative. No, she knows what I'm talking about. They are on 200 pills of Dilaudid a month, you know. So nothing negative, but that's the reality. But I just wanted to touch on one subject, and that is my connections in Africa with sickle cell disease. I think the more the awareness, the less the stigma, but still, in Africa there is, which I don't hear here, is there's such strong stigma where people feel that they suddenly get discounted, devalued when people find out that they have sickle cell disease. One of my patients, she said, you know, I've been dating this guy for a year, and he took me to meet his mother, and she said, oh, you couldn't do better than a sickler? People, there are some beautiful videos, I wish we had shown them in this setting, about, you know, people feeling or made to feel little or less beyond pain. You know, stigma of pain is very real in US, where there's pain medication. They have no pain medication in Africa. I mean, that's the reality of beyond paracetamol and ibuprofen. So, but beyond pain, they have this stigma of being made to feel less.
Yes.
And do you folks in US feel the same way? That was my only question.
Go ahead, Nikki.
Okay, I'll explain. I had a crisis one time, and I had to go. I was visiting friends out of state, and I had to seek care in a hospital that I was not familiar with, and they were not familiar with me. There was something that the nurse said that struck me. She was like, I know every sickler here. How come I don't know you? And so, of course, in pain, attempted to educate, right? But it's interesting because hearing from not only my personal experience, but also patient perspectives is, yes, there is this need to kind of shield yourself from the judgment. Because it's, okay, when is the next time you're gonna go into the hospital? Or can we really plan an activity or an event this far ahead? Because you don't know what tomorrow looks like as far as your pain is concerned. And so there is a fear dating, right? Because oftentimes you have to very early on state, look, this is something that comes with me. And I need to know where you are as far as your status in sickle cell, right? And they are tough conversations because of the lack of awareness and the lack of knowledge within our community. And so the judgment is not only from clinical perspective, it's personal. And yes, definitely I've experienced that. And how you overcome is you just continue to talk and say, look, I have sickle cell doesn't have me, right? It's just part of the package. And so I definitely have experienced what you've discussed.
Very shortly, since people are coming in, I also agree. I was literally just in the hospital for 3 weeks, and I felt bad about being in the hospital for 3 weeks. Like, there's almost like every time you're admitted, there's a sense of guilt and failure, like, this is my fourth, admission this year. I wonder if my hematologist thinks I'm a drug addict, like the ER doctors, call us. So there's always this fear of being judged. You hear words like sickler. I hate that term. Frequent flyers, no, I'm not a frequent flyer in the ER. Like, you're not treating my pain. You're ignoring my pain. You have to remember, I've been on narcotics since I was 6 months old. And so now we're living in the opioid epidemic, right? And sickle cell patients have been on narcotics for their entire lives. Less than 1% of sickle cell patients OD. And now we're being swept up with people who are overdosing. And now we're being punished. That is a disease that is so marginalized, and people don't even care about the disease. Now they're trying to take our medications away from us, and it's not even our fault. Our only medication.
But they have taken medications away. I hear over and over, less than 12, we don't let them get Tylenol number 3, or Tylenol with codeine. So my patients under 12, I'm not able to prescribe them narcotic. It's a lengthy pre-authorization process that just punishes us.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, I was already on morphine by the age of 12.
It requires, you can do it, but it's lengthy. I threatened to write letters. I showed them the letters I had written about pre-authorization. I threatened to write letters, and then sometimes they would go.
Right.
That was wonderful.
I think there's one last question, I think. Did you have a question? You can sit down if you feel comfortable.
Thank you. I had a question and a comment. Years ago, I have two family members, one family member that had 2 infants, and both of her infants passed away from sickle cell. And the father had the sickle cell trait and the mother had the sickle cell trait, which ended up with both the babies passing away after they were maybe like a year or 2 old. Then I had a roommate, the very first time I'd had a roommate that had sickle cell, and she couldn't take the air conditioning. So I was kind of trying to figure it out as to why the house was always so hot. And it's like, she said, I can't take the air conditioning. So, we talking about summertime, and it would be 100 degrees in the house in the summertime. And I was trying my best to understand that, and me not knowing at all what she was going through. I wasn't there very long. But it's like, I don't understand it. I do know that it's a very serious illness, especially if it would kill infants. But we need to know more about it. I would like to learn more about it because it's very serious. And I put it in the same category with lupus, because I was misdiagnosed with lupus for 2 years, given lupus medication when I had HIV. So I had a doctor prescribing lupus medication to me, misdiagnosing me. But these are very serious illnesses, and we need to learn about all of them a little bit more.
Thank you for your comment. And, this question was kind of asked in the beginning. You have to get involved. You have to reach out and find out what your local sickle cell organizations are. You have to donate. Sickle cell disease get the least funding out of all the diseases in the United States. Even if it's $5. $5 means a lot, Start having conversations. I do have a blog. It's called chronicallysickle.com, and you can learn about sickle cell. I write about it very in depth. And if you do need resources, I can speak with you after the session, and I can plug you in. Thank you. Oh, hold on, I think one more. I don't know if we could take it. I think it's okay.
We just had a campaign at my church. We collected money it was called Jars for sickle cell. My pastor's daughter, she has it, and I have the trait. And we couldn't find where to drop off the donations at. And that was strange. I'm like, well, they have a place where you could drop off of breast cancer and diabetes, but where could... funding. I'm like, and we collected over $3,000 because everybody brought in a jar. everybody in the church, we had gave them a jar and they filled up the jars 2 and 3 times. But we didn't have nowhere to drop off the donations.
As I walk back up, so the reason why is because we talked about this earlier too. When it comes to sickle cell disease, sickle cell patients are expected to advocate for themselves. But when it comes to other diseases get the advocation of the world. So why is it that us warriors have to build our own nonprofits, run our own nonprofits, and raise money for our own nonprofits? How is that possible? Why does that continue to have it happen? And I think that's one of the reasons why there's not anything local in your area. But you can search online because there are, as millennials and Z-Genners grow, we're not dying at 5 years old anymore. We are starting our own organizations, Yes, I can. So just do a Google search. Thank you all for the session. I hope you learned a lot, and if you need me to connect you, I can connect you in the end. You're welcome.